And we're continuing with the fifth chapter of The Cockatrice Boys by Joan Aiken. That night, Sana had a bad dream. She woke up in the cabin that she shared with Mrs. Church, shrieking her head off. She found herself on the floor, having rolled clean out of her bunk, which was the upper one. At the time, the train was stationary, waiting for daylight so as to resume its journey on the relayed track to Newcastle. Sana had been looking forward with painful excitement to revisiting the town where she had lived happily with her father and mother until they set off for that ill-fated Spanish holiday. Since then, she had never been back. If there was time, Colonel Clipspeak had promised, and not too many monsters about, Lieutenant Upfold might escort her to Dry Dock Street to look at her former home. Perhaps it was the memories of her previous life that had crept into her head and made her dream. At any rate, she let out such a fearful shriek that it woke every soul on the train. Guards cocked their snake guns, sentries switched on their battle flares, sleeping soldiers tumbled out of their berths and reached around for weapons. The colonel shot bolt upright in bed and shouted for Sergeant Bellswinger on the internal line. Alarm bells went off and the dog Yulie let out a series of shattering barks. "What is it, my duck? Whatever's the matter?" cried Mrs. Churt, who slept in the lower bunk, and had heard Sana fall past her and land with a thud on the ground, shrieking all the while. "Oh!" gasped Sana. "I just had a dream, but it was so awful." Mrs. Churt struck out a skinny arm and wrapped it comfortingly around Sana's shoulders. Now, dearie, don't take on. A dream's only a dream. Here, put a blanket round you and let's us go along to the galley and make ourselves a cup of sassafras tea." With her teeth chattering, Sana meekly obliged. Half the train was awake and stirring by now, and Mrs. Churt had to make about 30 cups of sassafras tea and find a bowl of marrow broth for Yulie, who also slept in her cabin. Sana had landed on him when she fell, which helped break her fall, but left Yulie feeling rather hard done by. What was the dream about, my child?" asked Dr. Wren, when the startled soldiers had drunk their tea and gone grumbling back to their beds or their watch posts. "Oh, sir, it was so awful. I was with Mam and Dad, and we were going on holiday in the train, and we came to a station called Delors, and my dad said, that means sorrow in French." "So it does," said the Archbishop. "Dolor. Well, we got out at this station with our bags, and we got a horse and a trap to take us where we were going, the place called Bride's Bridge, where we always used to stay. I saw a street sign that said Sorrow Street, and when we got to the place, Mam said to me, 'You'll want to go and see our Aunt Allie while we do the unpacking. She'll give you some of her treacle candy for sure, or some of her fauchebers. Those were cakes and sweeties that Aunt Allie used to make.' Yes, my child. So I went along the road to Aunt Allie's cottage. I could hear the river rumbling like the sound of gunfire. It was in spate, rushing down between the rocks. And then I came to Aunt Allie's cottage up the hill. It was a small stone house thatched with reeds and heather, and her voice shook. Oh, it was awful, she murmured. What was, my child? The Archbishop's voice was comforting but firm. Outside the door there was standing a thing. What kind of a thing? Well, it was shaped like a person, but it was all made of withies, willow wands, wicker, like a fence, bent and twisted into a shape. It was dark brown. You could see right through it between the wands, like a lobster pot. There was a shape for the head and a shape for the chest, and two arms that were just made of several thin wands bunched together and curved into claws for the hands. The ones for the head was all coiled round in a bundle. The hands were springy and dark, almost black. Calmly, take it calmly now, my dear. And down below there was legs coming out from under its skirt. They were all wet and muddy, as if it had waded out of the brook. Gently now, take a deep breath. And it began to walk towards me. It began to raise its arms, and I couldn't stand it. I woke up yelling. And I don't blame you at all, said the Archbishop. A most disagreeable dream, terrifying. I should have yelled myself. Sir, what does it mean? What was that thing? Child, it was nothing but a scarecrow put together to frighten you. But it was alive. No, it was a puppet or a marionette hanging on strings, moved by somebody up above. If Dr. Wren had intended to soothe Sana by this suggestion, he had not succeeded. She whispered, "But then who was that somebody? Where were they? In the house?" Child, this was all this was only your dream." "What do you make of that, Mrs. Churt?" said Dr. Wren quietly. When after much soothing and administration of calming potions, Sana had at last been persuaded back to bed, Dr. Wren and Mrs. Churt had struck up a friendship, which began when they found they had shared the same birthday, March the 1st, and went on when she discovered that he suffered from chilblains, and cursed them and cured them in half a day with her comfrey ointment. They had discussions on many topics, and the Archbishop often did a row in her cross-stitch while they canvassed such problems as how to deal with hysterics, nightmares, stammering, hiccups, and fear of death. "Well, sir, if you ask me, they're just trying to scare the girl," said Mrs. Churt quietly. "But she don't scare easy, Sana don't, if she's given time to pull herself together." "Ah," said Dr. Wren thoughtfully. He took a couple of stitches. Then he said, "And who are they, Mrs. Churt?" "Why, sir, the bad ones." Next day the Cockatrice Bell crept across the River Tyne and was received with great acclaim and rejoicing by the citizens of Newcastle. The climate so far north was on the chilly side for snarks, and so there were not a great many of these pests, but the city was much bedeviled by kelpies and trolls. Both these monsters were very unpleasant and dangerous. The kelpies were large, slow-moving creatures with webbed feet, the bodies of horses or cows, and human faces. They dripped water and seaweed, devoured any living creature they encountered, and were virtually indestructible, as their thick hides turned off all bullets and darts. Trolls were of equally large dimensions. They had hypnotic, fiery blue eyes and dynamic powers of self-transportation. They too were omnivorous, and had much reduced the population of Newcastle. Their only vulnerable point was that if caught away from home at the moment of dawn, they would turn to stone. It was thought they emerged at night from lurking places in Harwood Forest, some miles north of the city. Sometimes they were entrapped by their own greed if they lingered too long in the streets, munching their victims, and were overtaken by sunrise. There were quite a number of stone trolls to be seen in the city of Newcastle, and very hideous they were. "But there's one advantage," said the mayor, Walter Herdman. "Granted, they're not handsome, but they do serve as a useful warning to folks not to loiter about the streets after sunset, and they save the expense of putting up municipal statues, all free, gratis, for nothing." He considered and added, "Free except for the loss of life, that's to say. But any folk that's ganning about in the streets after dark is most likely to be foolish young harum-scarums, and have only got theirselves to blame." He said this to Corporal Clipspeak at the civic welcoming party, which was given to the crew of the Cockatrice Bell as soon as they managed to creep across the reconstructed bridge over the River Tyne. Newcastle, like Lincoln, had not suffered so severely as Manchester, for the inhabitants had managed to maintain risky contacts with the continent by submarine, so they were not short of food. But the citizens were hungry for news of the South Country, and very grateful, too, for the restoration of their bridge. Lieutenant Upfold, who was a chemist, had devised a gas made of mustard, ipecacuanha, daffodil juice, which had proved lethal to the hordes of kelpies when they climbed out of the Tyne and hindered the bridge-building crews. The kelpies had been routed and their numbers greatly reduced while the work was in progress, but unfortunately, just before the job was finished, the ingredients for the gas had run out, so it was almost certain that the kelpies would soon begin to multiply again. "Daffodil juice is the difficulty," said Upfold. "Now there isn't any chance of restocking until next spring." "Just think," said the mayor. of the days when we used to be able to import kiwi fruit and daffodil juice from New Zealand. We're really cut off here. We might as well be at the North Pole, but at least now we'll be able to get across the bridge to Gateshead. We are really obliged to you and your men, Colonel. Sana was allowed to go off on her nostalgic excursion with Lieutenant Upfold, but it proved a sad disappointment. Firstly, the handsome, busy streets of Newcastle, where she had skipped happily along on shopping errands with her mother or played hopscotch and Relieva with friends, were now silent, empty and half overgrown with nettles and grass, lined with dead leaves and crumpled paper. Very few people were to be seen. But there were mangy, ugly, menacing stone facsimiles of trolls who had been overtaken by daylight at the end of their nightly marauding. Then, when they reached Drydock Street, where Sana had been born and lived all her life until the plane crash, she found the little row of houses half demolished. "Looks like basilisks have been on the rampage here," said Upfold gloomily, staring about the burnt woodwork and blackened bricks, broken windows, crumbling walls, and scorched garden patches. "Oh, our house," wailed Sana. "Half of it's not there." It was the one at the end of the row. The roof had fallen in, and the interior, which could be seen through the broken windows, was heaped high with rubble and masonry. The door hung jammed on its hinges. Sana had hoped to get inside, but this was not possible. "I'm glad Mam and Dad can't see it," she said, gulping and wiping her eyes. "Mam used to keep it so nice, and Dad used to paint the door and windows each spring, and he grew leeks and sweet peas in the garden. Oh, why did all this have to happen?" she asked Lieutenant Upfold. "I don't know, Ducky," he answered her sadly. "Dr. Wren says it's human wickedness coming to a head, like a boil that wants lancing, and that things have got to get worse before they can get better." "I don't see how they can get worse." Sana's tone was despairing. She took a few steps into the tiny front garden, peering rather hopelessly at the muddle of broken bricks and smashed timbers, old bits of rusty iron, dragged cloth, and fragments of china that were piled there, higgledy-piggledy. "I wish I could tidy up a bit. I hate to see it like this." "No time for that, dearie. We'd best be getting back to the bell." "Oh, what was that?" A snapping sound, followed by a rumble of falling stones, had come from inside the house. "Lieutenant, some person's in there." "Most likely a rat, or it could be an echidna, or hydra. Come on, lovey. Let's get out of here. The Colonel would have my teeth for tiddlywinks if I let you run into danger. So would Dr. Wren." But as he caught her hand, almost pulling her away, Sana cried out, "Wait just a minute!" Under a piece of dirty rag, her eye caught a gleam of red and blue. She pounced and dragged out a small bundle, which she hastily tucked into her pocket as Upfold whisked her along the deserted street. "We dasn't take chances in these parts," he apologized, glancing quickly around the ruined neighborhood as they hurried along. "But what was that you picked up?" "Two things I was very fond of. I'll show you back at the station." When they were under cover, Sana displayed her reclaimed treasure. It was a pair of tiny old-fashioned dolls with china heads and cloth bodies, each of them not much larger than a handspan. The female had a striped skirt and red crossover shawl. The male a black hat, white shirt, and black trousers with a blue cravat. "To think I've come across them," Sana said, cradling them fondly. "I was telling Dr. Wren about them only yesterday." "Well, I'm glad our trip wasn't quite wasted," said Upfold kindly. "There'll be something to remind you of home. But I wonder who stuck this nasty great pin right through them. I never did that." The pair of small dolls were skewered together by a kilt pin, a kind of outsized safety pin, which was red with rust and pierced clean through their stomachs. "It's stuck," said Sana, tugging at it as they crossed the station. "I expect it's because the dolls are so damp. They're probably filled with sawdust. You'd better wait till you've dried them off and then grease the pin a bit," Upfold suggested. On the platform where the Cockatrice Bell had halted, they were overtaken by Tom Flint, also returning, it seemed, from a trip around Newcastle. He was out of breath and gulping, as if he had run from some pursuer. "Are you all right?" Upfold asked him. Who, me? Oh, yes. There's not a miss with me. But this place is a bit of a dismal dump, though, ain't it? I see you found something pretty, though, love, didn't you?" he added alertly, catching sight of the two dolls in Sana's hand. He was about to say something more when a volley of snarls from Yulie who was being exercised up and down the platform by Aiken, caused him to change his mind and hurry off to his own end of the train. "I can't fathom that fellow," said Upfold, looking after Tom Flint. "Why doesn't he take a ship home from Newcastle, instead of coming all the way to Scotland with us?" "Maybe he has an aunt in Scotland he wants to visit," panted Aiken. "Hey, Sauna, if you're done gadding about Newcastle, do you want to run Yulee for a bit? He's just about worn me out." "In just a minute. I want to put these in the galley to dry off." "Well, don't hurry yourself, your Royal Highness," Aiken called after her. He felt aggravated because he had not been included on the excursion to Dry Dock Road. And when Sauna came back, which she did very speedily, and was greeted by Yulee with loving enthusiasm as if she had been away for weeks, Aiken walked huffily away instead of staying to jog up and down the platform with her, as he would have normally done. "What's up, Aiken?" Sauna called, but he did not answer. He went off skulking to practice his drum, with a blanket spread over the skin to muffle the sound. Sauna looked after him, frowning faintly, but then forgot his crossness in her wonder at the discovery of the two small dolls. Who in the world could have stuck that great rusty pin through them, and why, and when? She must be sure to show them to Dr. Wren, she thought. They would interest him very much. And we will pause there.